There's a painting. It hangs today in the cool, silent halls of the Prado Museum in Madrid, a vast canvas of shadows and light that pulls the eye inexorably toward its center. There, bathed in a celestial glow that seems to emanate from her very being, stand a little girl. She is no more than 5 years old, her face a perfect oval of porcelain skin, her eyes wide and solemn, her silver blonde hair spun into a delicate confection. She is the Infanta Margarita Teresa of Spain, and she is the sun around which an entire world revolves. This is the masterpiece known as Las Meninas, a snapshot of life in the court of King Philip IV, painted by the master Diego Velázquez in 1656. It is a work of breathtaking complexity and artistic genius, a puzzle box of gazes and reflections. Yet for all its fame, for all the millions who have stood before it, the painting conceals a truth far darker than any of the shadows that creep at its edges. It presents a lie, a beautiful, tender, and ultimately devastating lie. For the innocent child at its heart was not the cherished princess of a fairy tale. She was a product, a political commodity bred and raised for a single, inexorable purpose, to be a vessel for the continuation of a dying dynasty. Her life was not her own. It was a meticulously planned, brutally executed sacrifice on the altar of Habsburg ambition. The story we are told to see is one of royal splendor and innocent childhood. The story we will uncover is one of calculated incest, genetic decay, and the slow, systematic destruction of a young woman whose body was considered nothing more than a womb for the state. We will look past the shimmering silk of her gown and the loyal gazes of her maids of honor to see the cage of flesh and blood that was being prepared for her. We will follow her out of the light of Velázquez's studio and into the cold, claustrophobic reality of her fate. This is the story of how the radiant child of Las Meninas was transformed into a tragic footnote, a queen consort dead at 21, her youth and health consumed by the very institution she was born to serve. It is a haunting exploration of the human cost of power, a testament to the fact that even in the most gilded of cages, the occupant is still a prisoner and often a victim. We must ask ourselves not just who this girl was, but what was done to her, and why her famous portrait is perhaps the most tragic piece of propaganda ever created. To understand the predetermined tragedy of Margarita Teresa, one must first understand the dynasty that created her. The House of Habsburg was, by the mid-17th century, less a family and more a biological crisis. For over 200 years, they had clung to power in Europe by clinging to each other. Their guiding principle was not conquest, but marriage. Let others wage war. You, happy Austria, marry, was their motto, and they followed it with a religious, self-destructive fervor. To preserve their vast territories across Spain, Austria, the Holy Roman Empire, and the New World, they turned inward, marrying cousin to cousin, uncle to niece, aunt to nephew. They sought to keep the bloodline pure, to concentrate power by concentrating their own genes. The result was a dynasty slowly collapsing under the weight of its own biological legacy. The infamous Habsburg jaw, a severe mandibular prognathism, was the most visible sign of this decay, but the genetic rot ran far deeper, leading to epilepsy, hydrocephalus, physical disability, intellectual impairment, and, most critically for a dynasty obsessed with succession, rampant infertility and high infant mortality. They were quite literally breeding themselves into extinction. Into this world of genetic twilight, Margarita Teresa was born on July 12, 1651. Her father was King Philip IV of Spain, a man already weary and melancholic, presiding over an empire whose golden age was fading into a long, slow sunset. Her mother was Mariana of Austria, who was not only Philip's queen, but also his niece. Mariana was the daughter of Philip's own sister, Maria Anna of Spain. This meant that Philip was simultaneously Margarita's father and her great-uncle. Mariana was her mother and her first cousin. Her four grandparents were, in fact, only two distinct sets of individuals. The family tree was not a branching oak. It was a tangled, suffocating vine that had turned back on itself. The calculated risk of this union was deemed necessary. Philip's first wife and their only son and heir, Balthasar Charles, had both died, leaving the Spanish throne perilously exposed. The 30-year-old Mariana was imported from the Austrian branch of the family to produce a new male heir and cement the alliance between Vienna and Madrid. The court into which Margarita was born was a rigid, theatrical, and deeply pious world. Spanish court etiquette, the strictest in Europe, dictated every moment of a royal's life, from the manner of their dress to the way they ate. It was a world of performance, where public image was paramount. For a royal princess, this performance had a singular goal. She was not raised to be a ruler, nor an intellectual, nor an individual with her own desires. She was raised to be a bride. Her value was measured by her dynastic connections and her reproductive potential. From a moment of her birth, Margarita Teresa was a piece on a geopolitical chessboard, and her future moves had already been decided. She was a symbol of hope for a fragile succession, a living link between the two great pillars of the Habsburg Empire. Her charming disposition and seemingly robust health as a child were therefore not just sources of parental affection, they were matters of state security. Margarita's early years, as captured in Las Meninas, with a deceptive calm before the storm. She was, by all contemporary accounts, a delightful child. Intelligent, vivacious, and possessing a sweet nature, she was the darling of her aging father, who saw in her a flicker of light in the gloomy halls of the Alcazar Palace. He nicknamed her "My Joy," but this paternal affection was inseparable from her political utility. Even as a toddler, her destiny was being negotiated in the chancelleries of Europe. Her hand in marriage was the most valuable diplomatic asset Spain possessed, and it was never a question of if she would be used, but how and when. The intended recipient was already chosen. Her mother's brother and her father's cousin, Leopold Ignaz, the young ruler of the Austrian Habsburg lands and Holy Roman Emperor. He was her uncle, 11 years her senior. The marriage was a strategic necessity, designed to bind the two branches of the family together against the rising power of France under Louis XIV. The personal compatibility of the bride and groom, one a small child and the other a young man, was utterly irrelevant. This predetermined fate was the defining force of Margarita's entire childhood. It was not a secret to be revealed to her when she came of age. It was the very air she breathed. Her education was tailored not for life in Spain, but for her future role as Empress in Vienna. She was taught German, instructed in the customs of the Austrian court, and constantly reminded of the great and solemn duty that awaited her. She was being groomed for export. This process of objectification is chronicled in a unique and haunting way. A series of portraits, starting with Las Meninas, Velázquez, and later his son-in-law and successor one Bautista Martínez del Mazo, were commissioned to paint the Infanta every few years. These were not simply family keepsakes. They were political documents, visual progress reports sent across the continent to Vienna so that Leopold could watch his future bride grow. We can trace her transformation through these canvases. The rosy-cheeked 5-year-old of Las Meninas gives way to a solemn 8-year-old in a blue dress, her expression already tinged with the gravity of her position. Then, a teenager in a somber black gown, holding a fur muff, her gaze direct but her face pale, the first hints of the Habsburg jaw beginning to emerge. Each portrait was an assurance to Vienna. The asset is developing as planned. She is healthy. She is growing. She will be ready. There's an almost chilling quality to this long-distance courtship by portrait, a process that reduced a living, breathing child to a series of images to be inspected and approved by her future husband and uncle. Her childhood was a performance, and these paintings were the carefully curated playbills sent to an expectant audience. The turning point in her life was not a single dramatic event, but this slow, inexorable tightening of the dynastic vice, a process that began at her birth and ensured that she would never have a moment to imagine a life other than the one chosen for her. The girl in the painting was already a ghost, her real life secondary to the political effigy she was forced to become. The long years of waiting were punctuated by births and deaths that only intensified the pressure on Margarita. Her mother, Queen Mariana, gave birth to a succession of children, most of whom were frail and died in infancy, further proof of the dynasty's genetic exhaustion. In 1657, a son, Philip Prospero, was born. He was a sickly, tragic figure, painted by Velázquez with an amulet dangling from his dress to ward off evil and illness. His existence temporarily displaced Margarita as the direct heir, but his obvious fragility meant she remained the crucial backup, the vital link to Vienna. When Philip Prospero died at the age of 4, just days before the birth of another son, the future King Charles II, the dynastic anxiety reached a fever pitch. Charles was the culmination of generations of inbreeding, a deeply disabled child who would suffer from physical and mental infirmities his entire life. His survival was considered a miracle, but his ability to produce an heir of his own was doubted from the start. This made Margarita's role even more critical. Her marriage to Leopold and the children she would produce were now seen as the ultimate insurance policy for the entire Habsburg enterprise. If the Spanish line failed with Charles, her children with Leopold could claim the throne. By 1666, the time had come. Margarita Teresa was 15 years old. The proxy marriage had already taken place, and now she had to make the arduous journey from the familiar world of Madrid to the alien court of Vienna. It was a grand affair, a procession of staggering expense and logistical complexity designed to display the wealth and power of the Spanish crown. For the young Infanta, it was a funeral procession for her childhood. She was leaving behind everything she had ever known: her aging, beloved father, whom she would never see again; her brother Charles, whose pitiable state she understood all too well; and the rigid but predictable structure of the Spanish court. She was traveling toward a man she knew only through letters and portraits, a man who was her uncle, to become an empress in a land whose language she had studied, but whose culture was foreign and, as she would soon discover, deeply hostile to her. The journey itself took months, a slow crawl across northern Italy and into the Alps. When she finally arrived in Vienna, she was met with a spectacle of Baroque extravagance that beggared belief. Emperor Leopold, determined to welcome his bride and impress his subjects, staged a series of festivities that lasted for weeks, costing a fortune the imperial treasury could ill afford. There were ballets, operas, including the premiere of Il Pomodoro, The Golden Apple, one of the most elaborate operatic productions of the century, equestrian displays, and fireworks. It was a magnificent public relations exercise, a celebration of the union of the two Habsburg powers. But beneath the glittering surface, the reality for Margarita was one of profound isolation and immense pressure. She was the star of a show she had not written, and her only role was to perform her duty. Her husband, Leopold I, was a complex and contradictory figure. He was deeply pious, a talented composer, and a man capable of genuine affection. Yet he was also famously melancholic, indecisive, and possessed the prominent Habsburg jaw in its most pronounced form. He was physically unattractive, yet he was the emperor, and Margarita was his possession. By all accounts, he was kind to his young niece-wife, and a real affection seems to have developed between them. They shared a love of music and theater, but their personal relationship was always subordinate to their dynastic function. From the moment she arrived in Vienna, Margarita was subjected to the singular, all-consuming expectation of court. She must produce a male heir. Her body was no longer her own. It was an imperial vessel. Her attempts to navigate this new world were fraught with difficulty. She arrived with a large Spanish retinue of ladies-in-waiting, confessors, and servants, and she clung to them as a link to her past. She insisted on maintaining Spanish dress, Spanish etiquette, and Spanish customs within her household. This created what was essentially a separate Spanish court within the German-speaking Viennese court. It was a defensive posture, an attempt to retain her identity in an alien environment, but it was a catastrophic political misstep. The Austrian courtiers, already wary of Spanish influence, grew to resent what they saw as arrogance and exclusivity. They derided her and her entourage as haughty and insolent. Xenophobia and court intrigue began to swirl around the young empress. She was isolated, surrounded by her own people, but alienated from the power structure of her new home. She was the empress, yet she was a perpetual foreigner, a Spanish plant that refused to take root in Austrian soil. The physical and psychological toll of her new life began to mount almost immediately. The primary front of this assault was the relentless pressure on her reproductive system. Her life in Vienna became a grueling, tragic cycle of pregnancy and childbirth. Less than a year after her wedding, in 1667, she gave birth to her first child, a daughter named Maria Antonia. While a daughter was better than nothing, it was not the longed-for male heir. The pressure did not ease, it intensified. The court watched, waited, and whispered. Margarita was pregnant again almost immediately. Her entire existence was now measured in trimesters, her health secondary to the potential occupant of her womb. This relentless biological campaign was waged against a body already compromised by its genetic inheritance. The latent weaknesses of the Habsburg line now began to manifest in the young empress. She developed a goiter, a swelling of the thyroid gland in her neck, a common ailment among the Habsburgs that was likely related to their genetic issues. Her once bright complexion paled. Her energy faded. The vivacious child from Las Meninas was dissolving into a perpetually exhausted, frequently ill young woman. Contemporary reports begin to speak of her melancholy, her growing sadness. She was trapped in a foreign court, disliked by many of its powerful figures, and locked in a life-or-death struggle to produce a son for an empire that viewed her as little more than a broodmare. The pregnancies continued, one after another, with devastating results. In 1669, her prayers seemed to be answered. She gave birth to a son, Ferdinand Wenceslas. The court erupted in celebration. Finally, the succession was secure. But the Habsburg curse would not be so easily denied. The infant prince was frail, a product of the same tired gene pool. He died before his first birthday. The brief moment of triumph turned to ash, and the grief-stricken Margarita was once again placed under the immense burden of expectation. The process had to begin anew. The imperial womb could not lie fallow for long. In 1670, she gave birth again, this time to another daughter, Maria Anna. This child also died in infancy. The following year, she suffered a debilitating miscarriage. Each pregnancy, each birth, each loss chipped away at her fragile health. The physicians of the Viennese court, armed with the primitive and often brutal medical knowledge of the 17th century, could do little to help her. Their remedies of bloodletting, purges, and strange concoctions likely did more harm than good, further weakening her exhausted body. She was caught in a horrifying feedback loop. Her failure to produce a surviving male heir necessitated more pregnancies, and each pregnancy pushed her closer to the grave. The joyful, spirited girl her father had adored was now a pale, sick, and sorrowful woman, haunted by the ghosts of her dead children and the crushing weight of her duty. By the winter of 1672, Margarita Teresa was pregnant for the sixth time in 6 years of marriage. She was only 21 years old, but her body was failing. The goiter on her neck was more pronounced. She was perpetually weak, suffering from what was described as a persistent cough and shortness of breath, likely symptoms of a compromised immune system and the immense physical strain she was under. She was a shadow of her former self, the light that Velázquez had captured on canvas nearly extinguished. The court still hoped for a son, but there was a growing, unspoken fear that the young empress might not survive another birth. The asset was breaking down. The final crisis came in the early spring of 1673. Margarita went into labor and, after a difficult delivery, gave birth to yet another daughter, named Maria Teresa. The child, like so many before her, was weak and would not live long. But this time, the mother's depleted reserves were gone. Complications set in immediately after the birth, likely a postpartum infection, the deadly puerperal fever that claimed so many women's lives in an age before hygiene. The court physicians descended upon her sickbed, but their efforts were futile. They were fighting a battle that had already been lost, not in the delivery room, but years earlier in the council chambers of Madrid and Vienna, where her fate had been sealed. Her final days were a grim tableau of 17th-century royal death. She lay in her state bed in the Habsburg palace, her body racked with fever, her breathing shallow. Leopold, her husband and uncle, was reportedly overcome with grief, staying by her side. He had grown genuinely fond of his Gretel, as he called her, but his affection could not save her. She knew she was dying. With the piety that had been instilled in her since childhood, she resigned herself to her fate. She received the last rites, bade farewell to her grieving husband and her one surviving child, the young Maria Antonia. On March 12, 1673, after 6 years of marriage, 6 pregnancies, and a lifetime of being a political pawn, Margarita Teresa of Spain, Holy Roman Empress, Queen of Germany, Bohemia, and Hungary died. She was 21 years old. The official cause of death was listed as bronchitis, but the true cause was the Habsburg dynasty itself. She had been sacrificed. Her body, treated as a machine for producing heirs, had been run until it broke. The tragedy is that her death was not seen as an aberration, but as a political inconvenience. The empress was dead, and there was still no male heir. The dynasty's needs were paramount and immediate. Even as Vienna mourned her, the search for Leopold's next wife began. The machinery of state could not afford to pause for grief. Margarita was disposable. Her purpose had been served, albeit unsuccessfully, and now she needed to be replaced. Leopold would marry again just 8 months later to another cousin, and then a third time, finally siring the sons he so desperately needed. Margarita's brief, tragic reign was over. Her funeral was a grand, somber affair befitting an empress. Her body was laid to rest in the imperial crypt in Vienna, the traditional burial place of the Habsburgs. There she joined the ranks of the ancestors whose legacy had killed her, her small sarcophagus a testament to a life consumed by duty. Her only surviving daughter, Maria Antonia, would be subjected to the same dynastic meat grinder, married off for political advantage and dying young herself. The cycle of using women as disposable assets continued, a fundamental feature of the system. In Spain, her brother Charles II would reign as a tragic, impotent figurehead, the final, pathetic gasp of the Spanish Habsburg line. Upon his death without an heir in 1700, the Great War of the Spanish Succession would erupt, the very conflict that Margarita's marriage had been intended to prevent. In the end, her sacrifice, and the sacrifice of countless other royal women like her, was for nothing. The grand strategy failed. What, then, is the legacy of Margarita Teresa? For most of history, she was a minor figure, an empress who reigned for only a few years and failed in her primary duty. Her true immortality was secured not by her deeds, but by the brush of Diego Velázquez. It is in Las Meninas that she lives on. But this artistic immortality is a deeply ironic one. The painting that makes her famous is the very thing that obscures the brutal truth of her existence. It freezes her in time at a moment of perfect, privileged innocence, a moment before her life's purpose was brutally enacted upon her body. It presents the public image, the royal propaganda of the cherished infanta, while hiding the private reality of the sacrificial lamb. We look at the painting and see a princess. We should see a victim. The story of Margarita Teresa forces us to confront the profound cruelty that can lie beneath the veneer of civilization, power, and high art. It reveals a world where a child's life is mapped out before she can speak, where her body is a political battlefield, and where her health is secondary to the abstract needs of a dynastic house. Her parents, who undoubtedly felt affection for her, still participated in the system that would ultimately kill her. Her husband, who seems to have genuinely cared for her, was still the direct agent of her physical destruction, demanding pregnancy after pregnancy. They were all cogs in a machine of their own making, a machine that ran on the blood and bodies of its women. She was not an individual to them. She was a strategy, an alliance, a womb. Perhaps the most profound tragedy is the contrast between that luminous child in the Prado and the broken young woman who died in Vienna. The painting shows us everything she was and everything that was taken from her. It is a monument to her lost potential, her stolen youth. It captures the light, but the story of her life is one of the encroaching shadows. We must learn to see both. When we stand before Las Meninas, we should marvel at its artistic brilliance, at Velázquez's mastery of light and composition. But we must also remember the somber, horrific truth. We must look into the wide, solemn eyes of the 5-year-old girl and see the ghost of the 21-year-old woman she would become, a woman who died in service to an idea. Her brief, painful life, a testament to the fact that the most dazzling splendor can hide the most terrible of human costs. She is not just an infanta in a painting. She is a cautionary tale, a permanent, silent accusation against a world that valued her bloodline more than her life.